Chosen one. This message did not reach you by accident. If you are hearing these words right now, understand this clearly. Heaven already spoke your name long before you ever pressed play. There was a meeting you were never invited to, a conversation you never overheard, a verdict reached behind closed doors without your presence or permission. Decisions were made about your life, your future, your protection, and your elevation. And what was said about you would shock you if you knew the full weight of it. Right now, you may feel alone, disconnected, misunderstood, cut off from people you once believed would walk beside you forever. Faces you trusted disappeared. Voices you relied on went silent. Paths you expected to share suddenly split without explanation. But hear this truth slowly, and let it settle into your spirit. Your loneliness was never punishment. It was protection. It was not rejection. It was redirection. Not abandonment, but alignment. You were not pushed away. You were pulled forward. Chosen one. You didn't lose them. You outgrew the phase they were assigned to. Some people are only permitted to walk with you until a certain spiritual altitude. Beyond that point, their presence would have slowed you, contaminated your clarity, or exposed you to battles you were never meant to fight. Heaven saw what you could not yet see. What felt like isolation was actually divine insulation. What felt like silence was heaven clearing the noise. What felt like loss was the removal of unnecessary weight before acceleration. Before we go any further, do this one thing. Comment below, "I am chosen," like this video, to seal this confirmation. Subscribe, because this channel speaks only what heaven authorizes. Now, take a breath, because now, let's dive deeper. There are seasons where God hides his chosen ones, not because they are forgotten, but because they are valuable. Diamonds are not formed in open fields, they are forged under pressure in darkness, away from careless hands. You are being refined where distractions cannot reach you and where counterfeit connections cannot drain you. The loneliness you feel is not emptiness. It is space being created for wisdom, discernment, and authority. Heaven separated you so you could hear clearly, see sharply, and stand firmly. Soon, what confused people will become obvious. What questioned you will respect you. What left you will watch from a distance as you rise without explanation. This is the quiet before alignment. This is the pause before acceleration. Stay grounded. Stay obedient. Stay still. Heaven is not finished, and the next chapter will prove why this season had to happen exactly this way. Point 1. The silent separation that confused you. Chosen one. The first sign you had entered a divine protection phase was not chaos. It was quiet. A strange, unfamiliar quiet that felt almost unsettling because you had grown used to constant noise, constant feedback, and constant emotional movement around you. People didn't leave all at once. They faded gently at first, almost imperceptibly. Conversations shortened. Messages went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. Energy shifted long before words ever did. And that is how divine separation always begins. God rarely announces removal because sudden loss shocks the soul. Instead, he withdraws access slowly so your nervous system can adjust to the new altitude. You thought something was wrong with you because connection suddenly felt harder, heavier, and less rewarding. But in truth, your spirit was being recalibrated for a different level of awareness. When your frequency rises, compatibility narrows. This is not elitism, and it is not rejection. It is alignment. You were no longer able to laugh at what once entertained you. You were no longer able to tolerate gossip, chaos, or shallow exchanges without feeling drained afterward. This was not arrogance. It was maturation. God was quietly teaching you discernment through discomfort, training you to recognize what pulls at your spirit versus what pours into it. The loneliness you felt was not absence. It was silence after noise, and silence always feels empty to those who are addicted to constant stimulation. But silence is not empty. It is precise. Silence is where instruction happens. It is where intuition sharpens. It is where your inner voice becomes audible again. Heaven reduces external voices so you can finally hear internal truth. In this phase, distractions lose their appeal, and old connections feel misaligned not because they were evil, but because they were seasonal. You were never meant to carry everyone forward with you. Protection sometimes looks like isolation, because growth requires space, and space requires separation. God was not punishing you by removing people. He was preserving you by limiting access. This was the beginning of your protection, the moment heaven quietly closed certain doors and whispered, "They cannot hear what you are about to hear, and they cannot go where you are being led." Point 2. Why God removed familiar faces instead of enemies. Chosen. 1. Many believe God only removes enemies, but that belief is incomplete and often misleading, because before God ever removes opposition, He removes familiarity. Enemies sharpen you. They force discernment, resilience, and spiritual alertness. Familiarity, however, can quietly keep you small. The most dangerous people to your destiny were not those who opposed you openly, but those who loved an old version of you, a version that was accessible, predictable, and emotionally available in ways that no longer aligned with your calling. They did not intend to harm you, and that is why the separation hurt more deeply. Their attachment was not to your becoming, but to your staying the same. God saw that remaining close to them would require you to keep editing yourself, dimming insight, delaying obedience, and shrinking your voice so others could feel comfortable around you. And because God protects purpose before comfort, He intervened, not with confrontation, not with dramatic endings, but with distance. Conversations slowly lost momentum. Shared language no longer landed the same. The emotional resonance faded. You did not fight. You did not explode. You drifted. And that drift was not accidental. It was surgical. God understands that if He explains too early, you might resist, negotiate, or rationalize yourself back into a space that was already too small. So He allows confusion to do the work clarity cannot yet accomplish. Confusion loosens emotional attachments without awakening the ego. It creates space where obedience can breathe. What felt like loss was actually insulation. What felt like rejection was restraint being lifted. Protection often arrives disguised as misunderstanding, silence, or unanswered questions. God knows that certain connections, if preserved, would require you to delay growth out of loyalty, and loyalty that costs destiny becomes disobedience. This is why peace returned not when they stayed, but when they left. This is why your spirit felt lighter, even while your emotions grieved. God was not punishing you. He was preserving what was emerging. You are not abandoned. You are being repositioned. When familiarity is removed, clarity follows. When clarity comes, you will see that what you thought you lost was never meant to walk with you into what God is building next. Point 3. The psychological weight of loneliness and why it was necessary. Loneliness does something precise and irreversible to the human psyche. It strips away borrowed identity, the version of you that existed only because it was echoed back by others. When no one is reflecting you back to yourself, When there is no audience, no reassurance, and no familiar reinforcement, you're forced to confront who you are without external confirmation. This is deeply uncomfortable, and this is why isolation feels heavy rather than peaceful at first. The mind searches for mirrors that are no longer there. The ego reaches outward and finds silence. You were no longer being affirmed, validated, or emotionally regulated by the presence of others, and so your identity was pushed inward. God needed you to meet yourself without applause, without feedback, and without performance. Not the version of you that survives through reaction, but the version that stands through conviction. Because the next phase of your life does not run on approval. It runs on internal authority. If you still required constant reassurance, you would be manipulable. If you still needed external validation, you would be distractible. If your emotional stability depended on how others responded to you, your purpose could be redirected by anyone with attention or withdrawal. So God allowed loneliness to burn away dependence, slowly, quietly, thoroughly. This was not abandonment. This was refinement. Psychological strengthening, nervous system training. You were being taught how to self-regulate emotionally, spiritually, and mentally without leaning on people as emotional anchors. You learned how to sit with discomfort without escaping it, how to hear your own thoughts without drowning them out with noise, how to stand in uncertainty without begging for reassurance. Loneliness forced you to develop inner structure. It trained discernment. It sharpened self-awareness. It exposed emotional habits that could never survive leadership. Because leadership requires clarity under silence, stability under pressure, and direction without constant feedback. This is how leaders are formed, in private, long before they are recognized in public. Before influence, there is isolation. Before visibility, there is invisibility. Before authority, there is self-mastery. What felt like being overlooked was actually being prepared. What felt like delay was recalibration. You were not forgotten. You were being strengthened at the root, where no one could interfere, interrupt, or corrupt the process. Point 4. What they said about you, when you were no longer accessible. Chosen one, when you stopped explaining yourself, people filled the silence with assumptions because silence exposes what noise once hid. When you stopped reacting, they projected meaning, because your stillness became a mirror they could not control. They said you changed, not because you became someone else, but because you stopped being who they could manipulate. They said you became distant, not realizing distance was the boundary heaven taught you to build. They said you were cold, when in truth you simply stopped burning yourself to keep others warm. What they were really saying was that they no longer had influence over your spirit, your emotions, or your direction. When access is revoked, those who benefited from access feel threatened, because entitlement disguises itself as concern until it is challenged. Your calm unsettled them because chaos could no longer hook into you. Your lack of emotional urgency confused them because urgency was the lever they once used to move you. You were no longer available for emotional labor, no longer absorbing unspoken expectations, no longer carrying invisible burdens that were never assigned to you by God. You stepped out of energetic extraction without announcing it, and that quiet withdrawal was louder than any explanation could have been. And heaven watched closely to see how you would respond when misunderstandings surrounded you, when narratives formed without your permission, when your name traveled through rooms you never entered. You did not retaliate, because retaliation would have proven they still had access. You did not defend yourself, because truth does not panic when it is questioned. You did not chase understanding, because clarity is not owed to those committed to misunderstanding you. That restraint was the test, not to see if you could endure attack, but to see if you could remain aligned while being misread. Many fail here, breaking their silence too soon, shrinking themselves to regain approval, or explaining wounds to people who caused them. You did none of that. You chose composure over control, obedience over validation, and peace over proving a point. That choice shifted something unseen. The moment you stayed quiet, heaven marked your maturity. The moment you stayed steady, heaven confirmed your authority. The moment you stopped explaining, God began explaining you through outcomes instead of words. This is why the season feels different now. The noise has changed because the test is over. You passed it, not by winning arguments, but by refusing to enter them. And heaven is proud because silence, when guided by wisdom, is not weakness. It is power under discipline. Point 5. The hidden training that happens in isolation. While you thought nothing was happening, everything was happening beneath the surface in ways that could not be measured by noise, movement, or visible progress. Isolation was never inactivity. It was incubation, a quiet season where the unnecessary fell away and only what was essential remained. In the absence of constant stimulation, your intuition sharpened, no longer dulled by opinions, expectations, or emotional static. Your discernment strengthened because you stopped negotiating your truth to keep peace with people who benefited from your confusion. Your tolerance for nonsense decreased, not because you became colder, but because clarity makes disorder obvious. You began to hear God more clearly, precisely because there were fewer competing voices, fewer narratives demanding your attention or defining your worth. In the silence, your inner authority developed steadily, like a muscle finally being used. You stopped asking what others thought and started asking what was true, and that shift, though subtle, was irreversible. Once your nervous system adapted to peace, chaos became repulsive rather than exciting. You realized drama is not passion, urgency is not purpose, and survival mode is not strength. God was protecting you not only from people who lacked honesty or maturity, but also from returning to patterns that felt normal only because they were familiar. Solitude taught you to sit with yourself without distraction or validation, reclaiming parts of your soul once outsourced to approval. Peace revealed itself as intelligent, organizing your mind, regulating your emotions, and anchoring you in alignment. This is why you cannot go back. What emerges next is not louder, but truer, grounded, selective, and firmly established in what God has already built within you. Point 6. The moment. Heaven determined you were ready. There comes a moment in every chosen one's journey when heaven pauses to observe, not to judge, but to confirm the depth of what has been formed within you. This moment is subtle, almost invisible, and that is precisely why it matters. It asks quiet questions that no one else hears. Will you remain grounded when applause disappears? Will you uphold integrity when compromise would be easier and faster? Will you keep moving forward when there are no signs, no reassurance, and no guarantees waiting ahead? This is the crossroads where many falter, not because they are weak, but because the silence feels unbearable. They speak too soon, trying to force clarity. They reach backward for familiarity, mistaking comfort for safety. They trade alignment for connection, peace for approval, and truth for temporary relief. You did not. You stayed when nothing was happening. You endured the stillness that strips illusions away. You resisted the urge to explain yourself, defend yourself, or abandon the path simply to feel seen. You trusted without evidence, and that trust reshaped you at a level deeper than words. In spiritual terms, this is not stagnation. This is refinement. This is the unseen phase where strength is purified, motives are clarified, and distractions are quietly removed. What felt like isolation was actually insulation. What felt like delay was precise timing. Heaven does not rush this stage because it determines what you can carry next. This is the moment when protection stops looking like separation and starts becoming preparation. Preparation of character, preparation of discernment, preparation of spiritual authority. You are no longer being hidden from harm. You are being readied for responsibility. The silence was not absence. It was observation. And what was observed was consistency, humility, and faith under pressure. That is why things are about to shift. Not because you demanded it, but because you proved you could be trusted with what comes after endurance. Point 7. What happens after the protection phase ends? Chosen. 1. The end of isolation is not loud. It is precise. New connections enter that do not drain you. Opportunities arise that do not require you to prove yourself. Conversations flow without effort. This is because you are no longer seeking resonance, you are attracting it. The people entering now are not here to take from you, but to walk with you, and those who could not follow will watch from a distance, still trying to understand what they lost access to. But you will not explain, because explanation is no longer required. You were never meant to be accessible to everyone. You were meant to be aligned. And alignment is the reward of the one who survives isolation without losing themselves.